The city was alive that night. Alive in the way only a summer evening in Manhattan could be. Street lights painted gold halos on the wet pavement. Taxi horns cried from somewhere far below, and the air buzzed with the mingled scents of rain and champagne. From the rooftop terrace of the Sterling Crown, the tallest hotel in Midtown, Isabella Ross stood at the glass railing, the wind teasing the silk hem of her gown. She was 6 months pregnant, her hand resting on the gentle swell of her belly. But her eyes weren't on the bump. They were locked on the glowing skyline ahead, where the first firework burst into the night, 1,000 silver sparks raining down against the inky sky. The crowd behind her murmured with delight. Men in tailored tuxedos leaned closer to women in backless dresses, champagne flutes clinked, and a string quartet played something soft and romantic. But Isabella wasn't really hearing any of it. Her mind was fixed on one image, far below, in the gold-lit ballroom of the Grand Astoria Hotel. Her ex-husband was kissing his new bride, Adrian Carter. Even from this distance, she could picture the smug curve of his mouth, the way his hand would rest just a little too tightly on Clarissa Hayes's hip as if she were a trophy he'd won. Clarissa, the same woman who used to be his mistress while Isabella ironed his shirts and pretended not to notice the lipstick stains on his collars. She could still remember the first time she saw them together in public. It had been at last year's Winter Lights Gala. She'd walked into the ballroom wearing a timeless navy silk dress, simple, elegant, and apparently forgettable. Across the room, Adrian had been laughing with Clarissa, who wore a gold gown so tight it looked like it had been poured onto her body. Clarissa had looked over, given Isabella one slow, appraising glance, and turned back to whisper something in Adrian's ear. Seconds later, both of them had been laughing. That was Clarissa, always making sure Isabella knew her place. And now tonight, that same mistress had become the wife. They think the show is for them. The deep voice came from just behind her. She didn't have to turn to know who it was. Daniel Layton stood close enough that the warmth of his presence softened the night air. He was dressed in black. Black suit, black tie, black shirt, and yet nothing about him blended into the background. Daniel was the kind of man who owned every room he stepped into without saying a word. "They have no idea it's for you," he added, his gaze fixed on the fireworks that were just beginning to crescendo. She glanced sideways at him, catching the faintest smirk on his lips. "You planned this?" "I planned everything," Daniel said, his tone as casual as if he just ordered an extra bottle of wine. "The timing, the angle from this rooftop, even the color scheme of the fireworks." "Daniel?" she started, half incredulous, half amused. He finally looked at her then, his eyes catching the reflection of red and gold sparks overhead. "Let them have their cake and champagne in that ballroom. Up here? This is your night. Every burst of light out there is a reminder of what you've built for yourself." Isabella's fingers tightened around the stem of her champagne glass. It was a reminder, yes, but also a statement. Adrian had always hated fireworks, claiming they were a waste of money. She'd loved them, had begged him for years to take her to see the New Year's display over the harbor. He'd never bothered. And yet, when she saw the invitation to his wedding reception tonight, complete with a rooftop fireworks finale, it had felt like a punch to the gut. He was giving her dream to someone else. Only he wasn't. Not really. Because while Clarissa stood downstairs in that designer gown, holding on to Adrian as if the spotlight were oxygen, Isabella was here, higher, freer, untouchable. And she wasn't alone. She remembered the moment Daniel had called her 2 weeks ago. She'd been at home, sketching designs for the Singapore resort project they'd been working on together, when her phone lit up. "Be in Manhattan on the 17th, he'd said without preamble. "What's happening on the 17th? "A wedding you're not invited to," Daniel replied, "and a rooftop party you are invited to. Mine." She'd almost said no. Almost. The idea of being in the same building as Adrian and Clarissa made her stomach churn, but Daniel had a way of making the impossible sound inevitable. Now, as the fourth round of fireworks exploded, green spirals, blue chrysanthemums, 1,000 glittering embers, she realized she was glad she'd come. Below, she could just make out the faint sound of cheers from the ballroom terrace. The reception was in full swing. She wondered if Adrian had seen her yet. If, in some stolen moment between the toasts and the cake cutting, he'd glanced up toward the rooftop and spotted her silhouette against the exploding sky. The thought made her smile. Not a petty smile, but the kind that came from knowing you'd survived something that was meant to break you. Daniel's hand brushed lightly against her lower back, steady and sure. "You don't have to look down," he murmured. "Let them look up." She exhaled, a breath she felt like she'd been holding for an entire year. The wind shifted, carrying the faint echo of the string quartet below, the scent of expensive perfume, the distant hum of a city that never slept. Somewhere far under her feet, her ex-husband was playing the role of a man who'd won. Up here, under the open sky, she knew the truth. She hadn't lost a thing worth keeping. The final firework lit the sky, a massive golden willow that seemed to pour molten light over the rooftops, bathing everything in a warm glow. In that moment, Isabella decided something. She wasn't just watching the show. She was the show. And Adrian Carter could choke on his champagne. Before the fireworks, before the rooftop, before the billionaire at her side, Isabella Ross had been someone else entirely. She used to be the kind of woman people described as nice. Nice smile, nice manners, nice enough to fade into the background of her own life. At 30 years old, she could pass through a crowded room without a ripple, polished, poised, pleasant. That was before everything imploded. She grew up on the south side of Boston, in a narrow row house that smelled of laundry detergent and her mother's pot roast. Her father, a high school football coach, was the kind of man who believed hard work could fix anything, from a broken window to a broken heart. Her mother, a nurse, believed in long hours, good neighbors, and never leaving the house without a clean shirt. They didn't have much money, but they had stability, and for Isabella, that felt like the same thing as happiness. She was smart, creative, and obsessed with buildings, how they looked, how they felt, how they seemed to hold stories in their walls. By the time she was 15, she was sketching floor plans in the margins of her math notebook. She earned a scholarship to study architecture at Columbia University, where she learned to marry her creativity with discipline. It was in New York during her second year that she met Adrian Carter. He was nothing like the boys she'd grown up around. Adrian had the kind of charm that could convince you to change your mind before you even realized you'd made a decision. He was a junior analyst at a mid-tier investment firm, still climbing the ladder, but already walking like he owned the whole building. He noticed her in the campus library one rainy afternoon. She was hunched over a drafting table, hair tied up, sleeves rolled to her elbows, tracing a complicated design. "Is that the Chrysler Building?" he'd asked, leaning against the table with a smile that could melt concrete. "It's inspired by it," she'd replied without looking up. "Do you always work this hard? Do you always interrupt strangers?" He laughed, and somehow, by the end of that conversation, she'd agreed to have coffee with him. From there, it was a whirlwind. Adrian had an instinct for knowing what people wanted to hear, and Isabella wanted to hear that someone saw her. Not just the straight-A student or the future architect, but her. He brought her flowers for no reason, walked her home in the rain, and told her she was the most interesting person he'd ever met. Within 2 years, they were married. Her parents were skeptical. "You barely know him," her mother warned. But Isabella, swept up in the fairy tale, didn't care. She left her job at a boutique architecture firm to support Adrian's career, telling herself it was just for a while. He needed her to host client dinners, travel with him to conferences, and keep their new apartment looking like a magazine spread. In the beginning, she didn't mind. She liked creating a home, liked being the steady half of a rising power couple. And for a while, it worked. Adrian was affectionate, ambitious, and generous, at least when things were going his way. But as his career skyrocketed, so did his ego. He started staying late at the office, coming home smelling faintly of perfume she didn't wear. His phone became a constant extension of his hand. Isabella told herself it was stress, that once he reached the next promotion, things would go back to normal. Then came Clarissa Hayes. Isabella met her once, at an industry gala. She was young, mid-20s, beautiful in that high-gloss, nothing-out-of-place way. Adrian introduced her as one of our PR assistants. And Clarissa gave Isabella a smile so sweet it made her teeth ache. At the time, Isabella dismissed her as harmless. Months later, she found Clarissa's earring in the back seat of Adrian's car. The confrontation was a disaster. Adrian denied everything, accused her of being paranoid, and turned the conversation into an attack on her lack of understanding about his job. She dropped it, not because she believed him, but because she was afraid of what the truth would mean. By their 7th anniversary, Isabella's life had shrunk to the walls of their penthouse apartment and the carefully curated image she maintained for his colleagues. She had stopped sketching, stopped dreaming, stopped seeing herself as anything but Adrian's wife. And then last winter, she discovered she was pregnant. It wasn't planned, but the news lit something inside her. She imagined Adrian holding their baby, imagined late nights in the nursery, imagined a future that might fix the present. For a brief moment, she thought the pregnancy might bring them back together. She was wrong. Instead of joy, Adrian gave her polite indifference. He started traveling more, spending weekends networking at events she wasn't invited to. When she suggested joining him, he said she needed to focus on resting. The final insult came when she overheard him telling a colleague that Clarissa was so much more fun than dealing with a moody pregnant wife. That night, Isabella stood in front of the bathroom mirror, one hand on her belly, and realized she was alone in every way that mattered. She filed for divorce 2 weeks later. It was the hardest thing she'd ever done. She had no plan, no safety net beyond the small savings she'd squirreled away over the years. But she had something Adrian had long forgotten: her own identity. The first months after the split were brutal. She moved into a modest apartment downtown, went back to working part-time for an architectural nonprofit, and tried to ignore the tabloids that splashed Adrian and Clarissa across their pages. And then Daniel Leighton reappeared in her life. She'd met him years earlier at a design conference in Singapore, back when she was still with Adrian. Daniel, already a billionaire developer, had admired her work on a hotel renovation and told her she had an eye that could change skylines. At the time, she'd laughed it off, flattered but not taking him seriously. Now when he called out of the blue and offered her a position as lead designer on a major project, she hesitated. She was pregnant, still raw from the divorce, and unsure she was ready to step back into the world she'd left. Daniel didn't push. "You don't have to prove anything to me," he'd said, "but you might want to prove something to yourself." She took the job. Working again felt like breathing after being underwater for too long. She poured herself into the Singapore project, rediscovering the part of her that loved lines and light and possibility. Daniel became both her mentor and her friend, the kind who noticed when she skipped lunch and made sure she had a car waiting when her feet swelled at the end of the day. By the time the project neared completion, Isabella wasn't just Adrian's ex-wife anymore. She was Isabella Ross, architect, designer, soon-to-be mother, and a woman who had built something of her own. She didn't know it then, but the fireworks on the rooftop would be the perfect punctuation to the sentence she'd been writing all year. "I am more than what you left behind." The Grand Astoria Hotel was the kind of place that had no quiet corners. Even its shadows seemed lit with gold. Perched on the edge of Central Park, it was a century-old landmark that had hosted presidents, movie stars, and royalty. Its marble lobby stretched high enough to hold the sound of 100 conversations at once, the chandeliers above scattering diamonds of light across polished floors. Bellmen in crisp uniforms glided past, their movement so smooth it was almost like choreography. Even the air smelled expensive, a mixture of gardenias from the floral arrangements and the faint, sweet scent of aged champagne. On this particular summer night, the Grand Astoria was humming at full capacity. The Winter Lights Gala might have been the city's most prestigious charity event in December, but the July Society Ball was the crown jewel of the social season. And this year, it doubled as Adrian Carter's wedding reception. The ballroom itself was a study in decadence. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the glittering skyline, the glass polished so perfectly it seemed invisible. 10 crystal chandeliers hung from the soaring ceiling, each one dripping with hand-cut prisms. White roses and orchids cascaded from towering centerpieces, their petals so flawless they looked fake. Tables were dressed in gold-embroidered linens, and every place setting had been laid with surgical precision. fine china edged with platinum, gold-plated cutlery, and crystal stemware that caught the light like prisms. Isabella had been in that ballroom before. She'd walked those polished parquet floors when she was still Mrs. Carter, playing hostess at Adrian's corporate events. Back then, she'd thought the Grand Astoria was magical. Now she knew better. Magic, she'd learned, was only ever an illusion. Tonight, the ballroom was a stage, and Adrian, as always, was playing the lead role. He stood near the center, hand on Clarissa's waist, his tuxedo tailored to perfection. Clarissa's gown was a deep, liquid red, slit high enough to make older women raise their eyebrows and younger women take notes. Every move she made was deliberate, from the tilt of her chin to the way she leaned into Adrian's side when the photographers circled. From the rooftop terrace above, Isabella could see them through the glass. The way Adrian's smile broadened when someone of influence approached. The way Clarissa's fingers traced lazy patterns on his lapel. They were basking in the glow of their own performance, utterly certain the night belonged to them. But the rooftop, her rooftop, was another world entirely. Daniel Leighton's private celebration was in full swing, and while it didn't have the head count of the ballroom below, it outclassed it in every way that mattered. A string quartet played softly in the corner, their music blending with the faint pop of champagne corks. White drapes fluttered in the warm evening breeze, framing views of the city that made even the jaded guests pause to admire. The crowd here was smaller but sharper. Venture capitalists in understated Italian suits, gallery owners in sleek black dresses, and a smattering of celebrities who preferred conversation to camera flashes. Waiters moved silently between the guests, offering canapés that looked like miniature works of art, smoked salmon folded into rose shapes, caviar-topped blinis, and tiny bites of truffle-infused foie gras. Daniel had chosen the Sterling Crown's rooftop for a reason. The building was taller than the Grand Astoria by several floors, giving its terrace a commanding view not just of the skyline, but of the smaller rooftop below. From here, the fireworks would look like they were exploding over them. And that was the point. Isabella's silver gown shimmered under the terrace lights, catching more than one admiring glance from guests. She moved easily among them, answering questions about the Singapore resort project, listening as people spoke about architecture like it was the new art form of the decade. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't there to be someone's plus one. She was the draw. Still, her eyes kept drifting to the glass wall below, to the ballroom where she used to stand at Adrian's side. She could see the flash of cameras as the official photographer circled the happy couple. She could almost hear the clinking of glasses as someone made a toast. And somewhere in that carefully curated glow, she imagined Clarissa looking perfect and knowing it. She wondered if Clarissa had noticed the rooftop yet. Daniel noticed her glance downward and followed her gaze. "They're going to see you eventually," he said, sipping his wine. "Good," Isabella replied. He smiled. "You're not even pretending to be subtle anymore." "I stopped being subtle the day I left him." Down below, a small commotion caught her eye. Servers wheeling in a towering wedding cake, 5 tiers of white fondant and sugar roses. She designed a similar cake for her own wedding, back when she thought details like that meant something. Now she knew the cake was just another prop. The rooftop air shifted, the music softened, and Isabella realized the fireworks were about to start. Guests moved toward the glass railing, their conversations lowering to a hum of anticipation. From here, the display would appear to crown the city itself, each explosion painting the skyline in colors no architect could ever replicate. As the first spark shot into the night, Isabella felt the crowd below begin to shift. Heads tilted upward, glasses paused mid-toast. The ballroom's massive windows reflected the burst of silver light, but from the way Adrian's posture stiffened, she knew he wasn't looking at the fireworks. He was looking higher, straight at her. The terrace lights framed her like a portrait, her gown glowing, her hair swept into a loose chignon, one hand resting lightly on the curve of her stomach. Daniel stood beside her, his arm draped casually along the railing behind her. They looked, to anyone watching, like the hosts of the city's most exclusive event. For a heartbeat, the two worlds, the glittering chaos of the ballroom and the calm command of the rooftop, existed side by side. and Isabella knew which one she belonged to. The next firework exploded in red and gold, its reflection blazing in the glass between them. Down below, Clarissa turned to follow Adrian's gaze. Even at a distance, Isabella could see the faint tightening of her jaw. Daniel leaned close, his voice low enough for only her to hear. "Looks like the real show just started." And it had, because tonight wasn't just about fireworks, it was about altitude. And Isabella Ross was finally standing where she belonged, above it all. If Isabella's life had a turning point, it wasn't the divorce papers. It wasn't even the day she left the penthouse with nothing but a suitcase and the child growing inside her. The real shift happened months earlier, when she understood exactly who she was up against. Adrian Carter had always been ambitious. When they first met, that ambition had been magnetic. It made her believe he was the kind of man who could bend the world into shape if he just worked hard enough. He had a sharp mind for numbers, a quick tongue for persuasion, and a confidence that filled any room he entered. But ambition, unchecked, has a way of eating the person who carries it. By the time they'd been married 5 years, Adrian wasn't just climbing the corporate ladder. He was clawing his way to the top, and he didn't care who he stepped on to get there. His promotions came not just from performance, but from a kind of political savagery. He knew when to flatter, when to undercut, when to leak a rumor to the right person at the right time. And then there was Clarissa Hayes. If Adrian was a storm, Clarissa was the lightning bolt, bright, blinding, and destructive in ways that could burn down everything in her path. She'd started at Carter & Rowe Financial as a junior PR assistant, barely 24, with a resume padded with just enough half-truths to make her seem impressive. What she lacked in experience, she made up for in strategy. Clarissa understood people the way predators understand prey. She had a way of locking eyes with someone and making them feel like the only person in the room. She laughed just enough at the right jokes, asked questions that let men talk about themselves for hours, and always made sure to touch an elbow or straighten a tie before walking away. Those gestures were deliberate, breadcrumbs leading her targets exactly where she wanted them. When she set her sights on Adrian, it wasn't subtle. She started requesting to be assigned to his accounts. She found reasons to bump into him in the lobby before work and lingered near his office after hours. If she couldn't get his attention during the day, she made sure to show up at the same bars he and his colleagues frequented at night. Isabella noticed. Of course she noticed. You can't live with someone for years and not see the shift in their habits. The later nights, the new aftershave, the sudden interest in expensive cufflinks he never used to care about. When she brought it up, Adrian brushed her off. "She's just a kid," he'd said. "Don't be ridiculous." But Clarissa wasn't just a kid. She was calculating. And when she finally sank her claws into Adrian, she didn't just want him. She wanted his life. It wasn't enough to be the other woman. She wanted to be the only woman. That meant pushing Isabella out, but doing it in a way that made Adrian think it was his idea. She started planting seeds. Little comments about how tired Isabella looked lately, how it must be so hard for her to keep up with his career demands. She'd frame them as sympathy, but the message was always the same. You could do better. The moment Clarissa realized Isabella was pregnant, she doubled down. The pregnancy wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a threat. A child meant a lifelong tie between Adrian and Isabella, a bond that even divorce couldn't erase. Clarissa couldn't have that. She began whispering about how some women used babies to trap men, how it would be so much easier for Adrian if he didn't have to juggle fatherhood with his climb to the top. Adrian never repeated those words to Isabella, but she didn't need him to. She saw them in the way his eyes darted away when she talked about the baby's future. She heard them in the silence that followed her excitement about picking out a crib. The final proof came one night when Isabella accidentally overheard a phone call. Adrian was in his home office, the door half open, his voice low. "She's making it all about her," he was saying. "I can't deal with the mood swings, the complaints. I need someone who can keep up with me, not drag me down." A pause, then a laugh. "Yeah, you're exactly what I need." She didn't need to hear Clarissa's voice on the other end to know who it was. From that moment, Isabella stopped pretending she didn't know. She started paying attention. Not just to what they did, but to how they operated. Adrian's weakness was his ego. Clarissa's was her hunger. Together, they were dangerous, but they were also predictable. She learned that Adrian's wedding to Clarissa wasn't just about love or lust. It was a business move. Adrian's firm had recently landed a deal with a luxury lifestyle brand, and Clarissa's social media presence made her the perfect face for their joint ventures. By marrying her, Adrian was doubling his influence. Clarissa, in turn, was securing her place at the table she'd been eyeing for years. They weren't just building a marriage, they were building an empire. And like all empires, it needed an audience. That's why they'd chosen the Grand Astoria for the reception, invited half the city's power players, and scheduled the fireworks display. They wanted to be seen. They wanted the world to watch them win. What they didn't expect was for Isabella to show up, higher than them, both literally and figuratively, with Daniel Leighton at her side. If Clarissa had been the match that lit the fire, Adrian had been the gasoline. But what neither of them understood was that Isabella had learned from both of them. She'd watched Adrian network and manipulate. She'd watched Clarissa plot and execute. And somewhere in the rubble of her old life, she'd gathered those lessons and built something new. She didn't need to confront them in the ballroom. She didn't need to make a scene. All she had to do was let them look up. And they would. Because Adrian couldn't stand the idea of not knowing who was in the room. Clarissa couldn't bear the thought of another woman stealing her spotlight. The rooftop was bait, and they would take it. Isabella had been underestimated before. She doubted it would happen again. It started with a sound. Not loud, not dramatic, just the faint, unmistakable clink of glass on glass. Isabella heard it even above the hum of rooftop conversation. Somewhere below, in the Grand Astoria ballroom, someone was tapping a champagne flute. A toast. She didn't have to see it to picture the scene. Adrian standing tall, one arm looped around Clarissa's waist, smiling like a man who believed he had conquered the world. Clarissa leaning into him, her red gown clinging to every curve, her diamond earrings catching the light. The guests would be leaning forward, drinks in hand, hungry for the words of the golden couple. From her vantage point above, Isabella could see the top halves of the crowd through the panoramic glass. The ballroom lights burned bright enough to make the city outside fade into darkness, turning the people inside into moving silhouettes. "They're about to make their big moment," Daniel murmured beside her, his voice low but steady. She didn't answer. She couldn't. Not when the old ache was pressing at her chest. This was the kind of event she used to plan for Adrian, the kind she had poured hours into, making sure every detail was perfect. And now, she was watching it unfold without her, replaced so seamlessly it was as if she'd never existed. In the ballroom, Adrian began speaking. She couldn't hear the words, but she knew the rhythm. He was a practiced speaker, a man who could tell you he was ruining your life and make it sound like a favor. The guests laughed at the right moments, lifted their glasses when prompted. Then it happened. Clarissa turned her head just enough to follow Adrian's gaze, and that gaze was pointed upward, directly at Isabella. Even from a distance, Isabella saw the flicker of recognition in his eyes. Surprise first, then something sharper. Confusion, maybe even irritation. He hadn't expected her here. He certainly hadn't expected her looking like this, elegant, poised, a silver gown draped over her growing belly like liquid moonlight. And she wasn't alone. Daniel Leighton stood beside her, casual but commanding, the kind of man whose presence didn't need to be announced. Clarissa's smile faltered, just a hair. Her grip on Adrian's arm tightened. She said something to him, her lips barely moving, but the tension in her jaw was visible even from the rooftop. The guests noticed, first a few, then more. Heads tilted upward, curious. A murmur rolled through the ballroom like a wave hitting shore. Someone near the glass pointed toward the terrace above. Cameras, actual cameras, swiveled upward. Isabella didn't move. She didn't smile, didn't wave, didn't give them anything but her stillness. The wind caught the loose tendrils of her hair, the terrace light catching the diamonds at her ears. She was a portrait framed in glass and sky. Daniel, of course, understood the moment. He stepped slightly closer, resting his arm along the railing behind her in a gesture that could be read as protective or possessive. Either way, it would make its way into whispers before the night was over. From the ballroom, the energy shifted. The toast was over, forgotten. Waiters hovered uncertainly with bottles of champagne, unsure if they should keep pouring. The music stuttered before picking up again, but the rhythm of the night had cracked. Adrian was still talking, but fewer people were listening. Clarissa was smiling, but it was tight now, strained. It was a small fracture, barely visible unless you knew where to look. But Isabella knew, because she'd lived through the opposite, a moment when her control had cracked, when the humiliation had been hers. She thought back to that night at Le Jardin, 3 months into her pregnancy. She'd gone there alone, hoping to distract herself with her favorite risotto. Instead, she'd walked straight into Adrian and Clarissa, seated at a corner table with his parents. Clarissa had been in white silk, hair swept into a perfect chignon. Adrian hadn't even stood up. He'd just given Isabella a polite, almost bored look and said, "We're in the middle of dinner, Izzy." The laughter from their table had followed her all the way to the street. That was the night she'd sworn to herself, never again. Now, as the rooftop crowd pressed closer to the railing for the fireworks, Isabella felt the shift in her bones. The roles had reversed. She wasn't the woman standing in the shadows of someone else's moment. She was the disruption. The first firework burst overhead, a white chrysanthemum that lit the sky and reflected off the glass between them. The rooftop guests gasped, tilting their faces upward. Below, in the ballroom, people moved toward the windows, their attention torn between the display and the woman standing above it all. She let the seconds stretch. Let the world below drink in the image of her standing with Daniel, the two of them framed by fire and sky. She didn't need to say a word. The picture spoke for itself. Adrian's eyes were locked on her now, his expression unreadable from this distance. But she could imagine the thoughts racing behind it. Why was she here? Why was she with Daniel Leighton? Why did she look like that? Clarissa must have asked the same questions, because she was whispering furiously now, her smile all but gone. Whatever spell she'd cast on the ballroom was broken, and she knew it. Daniel leaned toward Isabella, just enough for his words to be for her alone. "You don't have to do anything. Just let them wonder." The second firework exploded, red and gold this time, painting the terrace in warm light. Isabella's hand rested lightly on her belly, an unconscious gesture that would be noticed, analyzed, and dissected by anyone who saw it. Pregnant, radiant, untouchable. She didn't need to watch the rest of the show. She already knew she'd made her point. Down below, the applause for the fireworks was half-hearted. Guests began drifting back to their tables, murmuring to each other. Adrian's shoulders were tight, his jaw set. Clarissa was still smiling for the cameras, but it looked brittle, like glass about to crack. On the rooftop, Isabella turned away from the railing, her heart beating steady now. Daniel caught her eye and gave the faintest nod, as if to say, "It's done." She didn't look back. In the weeks after she left the penthouse, Isabella moved like a ghost through her own life. She rented a small apartment downtown, a one-bedroom in a pre-war building with creaky floors and a view of the brick wall next door. It was nothing like the glass and steel palace she'd once called home. The crown moldings were chipped, the radiator hissed in the night, and the hallway always smelled faintly of someone else's cooking. But it was hers. No security guards at the door. No elevator ride to the 32nd floor where neighbors smiled too politely but never really looked at you. And yet, for all its freedom, the place felt unbearably empty. She'd wake in the middle of the night to the sound of her own breathing, the silence pressing in like a weight. The bed felt too big without Adrian's restless turning beside her. Even his absence had a shape, a hollow in the mattress where he used to lie, a space in the closet where his suits had hung. She tried to tell herself it was better this way, that she didn't miss him, just the routine. But grief has a way of lying to you in your own voice. The pregnancy magnified everything. The hormones made her emotions unpredictable, swinging from quiet numbness to sudden tears. A baby was supposed to be a joyful thing, but joy was hard to find when you were eating dinner alone most nights, staring at the single place setting you'd bothered to put out. Her days had no rhythm. She tried to fill them, answering a few freelance architecture consultations, running errands, folding and refolding the tiny clothes she'd bought for the baby. But there were hours when she would just sit on the couch, staring at the muted TV, unable to summon the will to move. The lowest point came on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. She'd gone to the grocery store for basics: milk, bread, prenatal vitamins. And as she was waiting in line, she heard laughter from the next aisle over. She didn't recognize the voice at first, then she did. Clarissa? She couldn't see her, but she could hear the bright, tinkling laugh, the one she'd once heard at the company holiday party when Clarissa was just a PR assistant. The laugh was followed by Adrian's voice, low but warm in a way it hadn't been with Isabella for years. She froze. Her heart thudded in her ears. For a second, she considered leaving her cart right there and slipping out the side door. But before she could move, they rounded the corner. Adrian looked immaculate as always. Pressed shirt, expensive watch, not a hair out of place. Clarissa was wearing a cream sweater dress and a smug little smile that deepened when she spotted Isabella. "Oh, hi," Clarissa said as if they'd bumped into each other at a casual brunch. "You look, well." Isabella's grip tightened on the cart handle. "I'm fine," she said, her voice flat. Adrian gave a small nod, almost like he was acknowledging an acquaintance rather than the woman he'd been married to for 7 years. "Hope you're taking care of yourself," he said, his tone as neutral as the weather. It was nothing. 2 sentences, over in less than a minute, but by the time they walked away, Isabella felt like she'd been shoved underwater. She left her groceries on the conveyor belt, walked straight out into the rain, and sat in her car until the windows fogged over. She cried until she could barely see, the steering wheel slick under her hands. She wasn't crying for Adrian, not really. She was crying for the version of herself that had once believed she could keep him, that her love and loyalty would be enough to compete with his hunger for something shinier. The days that followed blurred together. She stopped checking the news. She avoided the social pages. She muted mutual friends on social media so she wouldn't have to see their photos from events she used to attend. She didn't even notice the letter at first. It had been slid under her apartment door. No postage, just a heavy cream envelope with her name written in bold black ink. Inside was a note: "I hear you're too good to be forgotten. Let's talk." Signed simply, DL. It took her a full hour to realize who it was. Daniel Leighton. They hadn't spoken in years. Not since that conference in Singapore when he'd admired her hotel renovation designs. She almost didn't call. She didn't want pity. She didn't want a handout. But something about the note stuck with her. The way it implied not just recognition, but belief. When she finally dialed, Daniel answered on the second ring. "I was starting to think you wouldn't call," he said, his tone amused. "I wasn't sure you meant it," she admitted. "I don't write things I don't mean. Meet me for lunch tomorrow. And before you say no, yes, I know you're pregnant, yes, I have a driver, and yes, the food will be worth it." She almost laughed, and the sound startled her. It had been so long since she'd heard her own voice lighten. The next day, she met him at a quiet corner table in an art-filled restaurant she'd never have found on her own. He didn't waste time with small talk. "I'm building something," he said, sliding a leather portfolio across the table. "A resort in Singapore, modern, sustainable, a statement piece, and I want you to design it." She blinked. "You want me?" "I want your eye," he corrected, "and your stubbornness. You see space the way I do, full of potential. I've been following your work, even the small projects. You haven't lost it." Her throat tightened. "Daniel, I haven't worked on anything that scale in years. You're pregnant, not broken," he said simply. "If you want the job, it's yours." That night, she lay awake in her little apartment, the portfolio open on the coffee table. She traced the outlines of the proposed site, imagining what she could do with it. The thought scared her and thrilled her. For the first time in months, she felt the stirrings of something she thought she'd lost entirely: purpose. The next morning, she called Daniel. "I'll do it," she said. And just like that, the slow, gray descent she'd been living in began to shift. It wasn't a leap to the top, it wasn't fireworks, but it was a step, and in that moment, a step felt like salvation. When Isabella agreed to take the Singapore resort project, she thought she was just taking a job. She didn't realize she was stepping into an entirely different league. Daniel Leighton didn't do anything halfway. His name was synonymous with architectural audacity, buildings that didn't just scrape the sky, but seemed to challenge it. He was a billionaire developer with an empire that spanned 5 continents, the kind of man who could pick up the phone and have the mayor of any major city on the line in minutes. But what set him apart wasn't just his wealth. It was his eye for people. And Daniel had been watching her. In the first week of the project, Isabella was flown first class to Singapore. Her hotel suite overlooked the Marina Bay skyline, the kind of view most people saw only in postcards. Waiting for her on the desk was a thick folder. Blueprints, permits, contracts, all neatly organized with a handwritten note. "You're in charge. Don't disappoint me." She worked like a woman possessed. The design had to be bold enough to make headlines but functional enough to operate as a luxury resort. She envisioned glass-walled villas hovering over turquoise water, a central infinity pool reflecting the sky, and an atrium filled with tropical greenery that would blur the line between indoors and out. Daniel didn't hover, but he checked in often. He pushed her when she hesitated, challenged her when she played it safe. "You're designing for the world," he'd remind her, "not for the version of yourself that played hostess in a penthouse." Weeks turned into months. The project began to attract attention from the industry press. Former architect turned high-profile designer returns with bold concept. One headline read. Another speculated, "Is Daniel Layton grooming a successor?" Isabella ignored the gossip. She was too busy reclaiming the part of herself that had been buried under years of being Adrian's wife. She made decisions worth millions without blinking. She negotiated with suppliers like she'd been born in a boardroom. And she realized something startling. She was good at this. Not good in a polite, competent way. Good in a way that made people take notice. By the time the resort's foundation was laid, Daniel called her into his office in New York. His headquarters was on the top floor of a tower he'd designed himself. Walls of glass, polished stone floors, art that looked like it belonged in a museum. "You've done more than I asked," he said, leaning back in his chair. "You've built something that's going to be talked about for the next decade." She smiled, unsure where he was going with this. "I want you on my executive team," he said simply. "Not just as a designer, as a partner. You'll get a percentage of the profits from Singapore and any future projects you oversee. That includes the coastal development we're breaking ground on next year." Her breath caught. "Daniel, that's what you've earned," he cut in. "Don't look surprised. I told you I don't hand out favors. I invest in people who can deliver." It hit her then. She wasn't just rebuilding her career. She was building an empire of her own. The timing was poetic. While her professional life was surging forward, Adrian and Clarissa's wedding announcements had started popping up in glossy magazines. They posed in vineyards, on yachts, at charity galas, Clarissa in increasingly extravagant gowns, Adrian always with that practiced smile. From the outside, it looked like perfection. But Isabella had learned enough about image to know perfection was almost always a mask. Then came the moment that shifted everything from personal satisfaction to something sharper. She was at a gala in Hong Kong, representing the Singapore project alongside Daniel, when she overheard a conversation at the bar. 2 American businessmen were discussing Adrian. "Word is, Carter's been having trouble closing that South Shore deal," one of them said. "His wife's been trying to help, pushing her influencer brand, but investors aren't biting." "Yeah, I heard they've got cash flow issues," the other replied. "You know who's swooping in?" "Layton. He's got someone new handling design. Apparently she's brilliant. Used to be married to Carter, if you can believe that." Isabella took a slow sip of her champagne, hiding her smile. The universe had a sense of humor after all. She didn't tell Daniel about the conversation. He didn't need the gossip, and she didn't need to give Adrian more space in her head. But the knowledge lodged itself deep. She wasn't just moving on. She was rising in ways that directly intersected with Adrian's world. By the time the Singapore resort opened, an event covered by every major design publication, Isabella's name was synonymous with success. She gave interviews in tailored dresses, spoke on panels about sustainable luxury, and turned down offers from firms that once wouldn't have taken her call. And somewhere in the middle of all that, Daniel became more than a mentor. It didn't happen with grand gestures or declarations. It was in the quiet moments, when he'd bring her tea during late-night design reviews, when he'd walk her to her car and insist she text him when she got home, when he'd rest his hand lightly on her back in a crowded room. They never labeled it, but the connection was there, unspoken and undeniable. So when the invitation to Adrian and Clarissa's wedding reception arrived, likely sent out of obligation rather than sincerity, Daniel was the one who picked it up from her desk. "You're not going," she said automatically. "Of course you're going," he countered. "Not to celebrate them, to remind them you exist, and that you're not just fine, you're better." She laughed, shaking her head. "You make it sound like a chess match." "It is," he said, his eyes glinting. "And you're about to checkmate." That was how she found herself on the rooftop of the Sterling Crown the night of the wedding, in a silver gown that caught the light like water. Higher than the ballroom. Higher than the fireworks. Higher than the life she'd once thought was the peak. And the best part? Adrian still didn't know the full truth. He didn't know she was now co-owner of one of Daniel's most profitable projects. He didn't know her designs had been chosen over his firm's for the South Shore deal. He didn't know she was wealthier now, on her own, than she had been in their entire marriage. He didn't know she'd already won. The day Isabella decided to reinvent herself, she didn't start with clothes or hair or even her apartment. She started with the one thing Adrian could never touch, her mindset. She'd learned the hard way that appearance could be faked, titles could be stripped, and money could be lost. But the way she saw herself? That was hers to rebuild. Her mornings began earlier now. She woke before sunrise, making tea in her quiet kitchen while the city outside was still stretching awake. Instead of scrolling through her phone for news about Adrian or avoiding it altogether, she read trade journals, architectural case studies, and global market reports. If she was going to play in Daniel's league, she needed more than talent. She needed to know the terrain. She started treating her body like the foundation it was. Prenatal yoga classes twice a week, swimming on Sundays, long walks through Central Park where she'd let herself think about the future without flinching. The changes were slow at first, but she noticed them. Better sleep, steadier energy, a clarity she hadn't felt in years. The apartment shifted too. She replaced the mismatched thrift store couch with a sleek sectional in dove gray. A vintage drafting table took over one corner, its surface always scattered with sketches and swatches. She hung framed photographs of her past projects on the walls, not as trophies, but as reminders of what she'd built with her own hands. And then, there was the wardrobe. For months after leaving Adrian, she'd clung to safe clothes, soft sweaters, loose dresses, anything that didn't demand attention. Now she wanted the opposite. With Daniel's quiet encouragement and his assistant's impeccable connections, she rebuilt her closet from the ground up. Sharp-shouldered blazers in cream and charcoal, silk blouses in jewel tones, dresses that draped over her growing belly without hiding it, as if to say, "This is part of my power." Her hair, once an afterthought she twisted into quick buns, now fell in soft waves. A stylist taught her the kind of makeup that didn't erase her features but sharpened them. Defined brows, a sweep of bronzer, a hint of gloss. She didn't want to look like someone else. She wanted to look like herself, turned up to full volume. The change didn't go unnoticed. At industry events, people began seeking her out, not just for her connection to Daniel, but for her own opinions. Reporters who once called her Adrian Carter's ex-wife now introduced her as lead designer on the award-winning Marina Bay Resort. Investors asked for her insight on projects she wasn't even working on. A magazine profile labeled her the architect redefining luxury for the modern traveler. And with each appearance, her confidence grew. But transformation wasn't just about how she looked, or even what she achieved. It was about how she carried herself in rooms where people once overlooked her. At a charity gala in London, she found herself seated at a table with a senior partner from Carter & Rowe, the very firm Adrian had fought to climb. The partner didn't recognize her at first. He spoke casually about the Carter wedding and how Clarissa was quite the character. When Isabella finally mentioned her role in Daniel's latest coastal development, the man's fork paused midair. "You're that, Ross?" he asked, eyes widening. She smiled, a small, deliberate thing. "I am." By the end of the night, he was asking if she'd consider consulting on a project his team was struggling to secure. She didn't commit, But she let him see she was thinking about it. Because the truth was, she'd learned the most powerful position in any negotiation was the one where you could say no. Her transformation reached its peak in the weeks before Adrian's wedding. Invitations flooded her desk, gallery openings, private dinners, investment forums. She attended selectively, each appearance a calculated move. Daniel accompanied her to some, but often she went alone, knowing it was just as important for the world to see her as an independent force. Still, the wedding loomed. She didn't obsess over it, but she didn't ignore it either. She knew there would be press. She knew Adrian and Clarissa would make it a spectacle. And she knew without question that she would be there, not in the ballroom, but somewhere higher, where the view was better. The week before the event, she and Daniel finalized the rooftop plan. The Sterling Crown Terrace was booked under his name, the guest list curated to perfection. The fireworks timing was coordinated to align with the reception below, ensuring maximum visibility. Every detail was deliberate. On the morning of the wedding, Isabella didn't rush. She spent hours at a private salon, sipping herbal tea while stylists worked. Her gown, custom-made in silver silk, skimmed the floor, the neckline elegant but daring. A diamond bracelet encircled her wrist, a gift from Daniel with a note tucked inside the box. "Tonight, you're the skyline." When she finally stepped into the mirror, she hardly recognized the woman staring back. Not because she looked different, but because she looked whole. That night, on the rooftop, she moved with the ease of someone who knew exactly how she would be remembered. Guests greeted her warmly, photographers angled for shots, and Daniel stayed close enough to signal they were a united front. But she didn't cling to him. She didn't need to. Below, the ballroom sparkled with its own kind of beauty, but Isabella knew where the real story was. She was no longer the woman crying in a grocery store parking lot, no longer the shadow in the back of a photograph. She was the focal point, the frame, the subject, and the light all at once. Her transformation wasn't about revenge, though that would come. It wasn't about proving something to Adrian or even to Clarissa. It was about proving something to herself, that she could be stripped of the life she thought she needed and still rise higher than she'd ever imagined. And as the first firework burst above her, she realized something else. She wasn't done rising yet. The rooftop air shimmered with heat from the July evening, but Isabella felt nothing but cool, deliberate control. Every detail of the night had been planned, from the silver gown that caught every glint of terrace light to the guest list, power brokers, designalists, and investors who shaped the city's skyline. From this vantage point above the Grand Astoria ballroom, she could see everything. The guests below were tiny, moving in elegant patterns around the tables. The chandeliers glowed like captured suns, the music floated faintly upward through the glass, and at the center of it all, Adrian and Clarissa were playing their parts. But tonight, the script wasn't theirs. Daniel stood beside her, hands in his pockets, his easy stance belying the fact that every move tonight was calculated. "They've seen you," he murmured without looking down. She knew. She could feel it. The prickle of attention from the ballroom below, the subtle shifts as guests turned their heads upward. Even the photographers who were supposed to be fixed on the bride and groom had started angling their cameras toward the rooftop. The first blow wasn't verbal. It was visual. Isabella and Daniel stepped forward to the railing together, perfectly framed in the terrace's soft light. His arm rested casually along the back of her waist, his posture relaxed but protective. She stood tall, shoulders back, chin lifted just enough to say without words, "I'm not hiding." Down below, Adrian's eyes locked on her. She watched his expression change in real time. Surprise, confusion, irritation. Clarissa followed his gaze, her smile faltering the moment she saw who he was staring at. A ripple went through their crowd. Isabella could almost hear the murmurs, the whispered identifications. "Is that with Daniel Leighton?" The power of suggestion did the rest. People didn't need details. They would fill in the blanks themselves. And the blanks they filled would sting worse than the truth. The second blow was timed. As the fireworks began, the rooftop string quartet shifted seamlessly into a live feed broadcast over hidden speakers. Not just on the terrace, but through a discreet arrangement Isabella had secured earlier in the week. 30 seconds into the show, The same music began plainly through the grand Astoria ballroom's sound system. It wasn't loud enough to disrupt, but it was unmistakable. The two worlds were connected, and everyone knew which one was higher. Daniel leaned closer, his voice just for her. "Time for the final act?" She nodded once. From the inside pocket of his suit, Daniel pulled a small envelope. Embossed in silver, it bore the Leighton Development's crest. A signal. One of his assistants, waiting by the ballroom entrance, moved exactly on cue. She approached a well-known business columnist, one who'd been covering the Carter wedding like it was royal news, and handed him the envelope with a whispered, "From the hosts upstairs." Inside was a simple press release. Leighton Developments is pleased to announce its latest coastal luxury project, with lead design by award-winning architect Isabella Ross. The project, projected to generate record-breaking revenue, recently secured the South Shore development contract, previously pursued unsuccessfully by Carter & Rowe Financial. It was a direct hit. Within minutes, phones began buzzing around the ballroom. Guests looked from their screens to the rooftop and back again. Adrian's jaw tightened. Clarissa's knuckles whitened around her champagne flute. The fireworks painted the sky in bursts of gold and crimson, but the real spectacle was the shift in atmosphere below. The reception had been about Adrian and Clarissa's union, their image, their power. Now that spotlight was splitting, bleeding upward to the terrace where Isabella stood untouchable. Daniel, ever the tactician, gave the crowd one last image to remember. He turned to Isabella, said something that made her smile. Not a small, polite smile, but a full, radiant one, and then clinked his glass gently against hers. Cameras flashed from both levels. It was over in minutes, but the damage would last far longer. By the time dessert was served downstairs, the gossip had crystallized into a narrative. Adrian Carter's ex-wife had risen higher, partnered with a billionaire, and beaten him to a coveted deal, all while expecting a child and looking like she just stepped out of a magazine spread. On the rooftop, Isabella didn't gloat. She didn't even glance down again. She mingled with her guests, took photographs, laughed genuinely at conversations. Her revenge wasn't in confrontation. It was in the contrast. And she knew, without needing to see it, that Adrian and Clarissa were stewing in the knowledge that she hadn't just survived without them. She'd surpassed them. Daniel caught her eye from across the terrace, lifting his glass slightly in a silent toast. She returned it, feeling something deeper than satisfaction. It wasn't just victory, it was reclamation. The night wound down slowly, the last fireworks fading into trails of smoke over the skyline. Guests lingered, reluctant to leave the height, the view, the energy. When the final group departed, Isabella and Daniel remained at the railing for a moment longer. "You didn't just make a statement tonight," Daniel said, watching the city lights flicker. "You changed the game." She exhaled, a long, steady breath. "Feels like I finally stopped playing theirs." The city was quieter now. The fireworks had burned out, the rooftop guests had gone home, and the Grand Astoria ballroom below was nothing but the faint glow of chandeliers through darkened glass. Isabella stood at the edge of the terrace, her hands resting lightly on the railing, the night breeze carrying the faint scent of orchids from the reception flowers below. It was strange, she thought, how quickly noise faded, how the voices that once seemed deafening could dissolve into nothing if you climbed high enough. Daniel had already left for a call overseas, but not before pressing a light kiss to her temple and telling her, "Don't forget to enjoy this, you earned it." She had smiled at that, not because of the words, but because for the first time in years, she believed them. She looked out over the skyline, tracing the lights of the bridges, the glimmer of water far below, the faint hum of the city that never truly slept. Somewhere out there, Adrian and Clarissa were beginning their married life, wrapped in the illusion they'd built. And somewhere even closer, people were already telling the story of the rooftop woman in the silver gown, the one who had risen higher than anyone expected. But Isabella knew the truth. The real victory wasn't in being seen by them. It was in no longer needing them to see her at all. The path here had been brutal. She had been humiliated, underestimated, pushed out of the life she built. She had cried in parking lots, stared at walls, felt the crushing weight of being alone. She had doubted herself more than once. But every day she'd gotten back up, Even if getting up sometimes just meant putting on shoes and stepping outside. People liked to talk about strength like it was a roar. But Isabella had learned it was often a whisper. The quiet choice to keep moving forward when no one was watching. The stubborn refusal to let someone else's version of you be the final one. And that was what she wanted other women to know. If anyone had told her a year ago that she would be here, standing in a gown worth more than her old car, a partner in a billion-dollar company, designing projects that would shape skylines, she would have laughed. She didn't feel extraordinary. She still didn't, not in the way people romanticized. She felt rebuilt. Piece by piece, scar by scar. She thought of the women who might be watching her story unfold, online, in whispers, in magazine spreads. And she wanted them to understand this. Your worth is not decided by who chooses to keep you. It's not measured by the ring on your finger, the address on your mail, or the name you sign next to someone else's. It's measured by how you carry yourself when those things are taken away. The elevator behind her chimed softly, and she turned to see one of Daniel's assistants stepping onto the terrace. "Sorry to bother you," the young woman said, a little breathless. "But I just wanted to say, tonight was incredible. The way you handled yourself, it was inspiring." Isabella smiled. "Thank you." "I mean it," the assistant said. "I went through a bad breakup last year, and I thought I'd never feel strong again. Seeing you, it makes me think maybe I can." Isabella crossed the terrace and took the woman's hands, a gesture so instinctive she didn't think about it. "You can," she said simply. "Don't rush it. Just start. The rest will come." The woman left a few moments later, and Isabella stood alone again, but she didn't feel alone. She felt connected to every woman who'd been knocked down and found a way to stand again. She took one last look at the city before heading inside. Her driver was waiting, and the night air carried a slight chill now, reminding her that summer wouldn't last forever. But that was fine. Seasons changed. People did too. As she slid into the back seat, her phone buzzed. A news alert. She opened it to see a headline splashed across the screen. "Isabella Ross steals the show at Carter wedding with billionaire partner and major business win." She read it without flinching, without the old tightness in her chest. She handed the phone back to her assistant and said, "Delete it." Because the truth was, she didn't need their headlines anymore. The car pulled away from the Sterling Crown, weaving through the glittering streets. Isabella leaned back, one hand resting over the life growing inside her, and felt a deep, steady calm. The future didn't scare her now. She wasn't waiting to be chosen. She was choosing herself. Every day, in every way that mattered. As they crossed the bridge, she looked out at the skyline. The same skyline she had once felt small against. Tonight, it didn't look so far away. Tonight, it looked like hers. And somewhere in the quiet space between memory and possibility, she made herself a promise. Never again would she shrink to fit inside someone else's story. She would write her own. So the story has ended. My wonderful friends, are you still here with me until now? If you are, it means something in this journey has touched your heart in a way words can't quite explain. Life will break you, yes. But as the old saying goes, a wound is where the light enters you. Every ending is just the start of a new design for your life, one you get to draw. If this story gave you even a spark of courage, drop a comment to tell me what part stayed with you. Share it so another heart might heal, and hit subscribe so we can keep walking through these storms together and rising higher.